Hey there, welcome to another episode of VLMD Rounds, a podcast on medical science and tools to optimize your health. I'm Dr. Vivian Lowe. So I am filming episode number 52 for VLMD Rounds, and what this means is that it's been exactly a year since I started this podcast. I have done one episode per week. We're at week 52, so we're at the 1 year mark. And I just wanted to take a pause and note that, I started this podcast because I was really hoping to start conversations around science and medicine that were deeper, more nuanced, that didn't just skim the surface and, stay very generalized, but that would actually look at some of the mechanisms and pathways related to the topics we were discussing. And I didn't quite know what to expect. I enjoy teaching. I enjoy teaching to my patients. I enjoy teaching other medical professionals. And I thought maybe let's just do this podcast and see what happens. One of the joys of doing the podcast has been meeting people who share that interest in science, who share that curiosity. I know this because I've seen some of the questions that you have put up on YouTube or have written to me or have just brought to my attention at the Livestream events. I love interacting with people and getting their questions, and I love just diving into those questions because it's that curiosity that drives me, and meeting other people who have that same curiosity is really very exciting for me. So I really enjoyed that piece. I've learned quite a bit from doing this podcast, and one of the things that I learned, 52 episodes down, it doesn't matter how many times you've done it. It's really hard to do a presentation for a mixed audience. And I knew that in the beginning, and I thought maybe I'd settle in somewhere and find a way to do it. I have to say, every week it's been a bit of a struggle for me to mediate between different audiences. And that's because, again, on the one hand, I want to reach a general public, right? A lay audience. On the other hand, I'm really excited to talk to people who maybe have more experience and who are, deeper into the science. So it's just kind of putting those two together and making sure that the episodes are not too technical on the one hand, but definitely I didn't want to go the too superficial route either. So that has been the main challenge for me. And now that I am at week 52, episode 52, same thing, I've just had some time to reflect a little, to think about what I want to do going forward. And I think, I'm not sure, I'm just throwing this out there, so maybe you can help me out with this. I'm just wondering if maybe I should cut down the number of episodes per month and just, do one episode a month instead of trying to hit one every week for VLMD rounds. And then I could also do one episode of a different format and a different channel, if you will. And this one would be more focused towards a lay audience, answering questions that people are curious about, but maybe don't necessarily want to go into the technical details for. Keeping VLMD rounds more for a specialized audience. So having that mix, but on two separate platforms, is what I've been thinking. So, let me know what you think, because I'm playing around with that idea. I mean, there's so many topics that I want to go into, but as I hope you've been realizing, you can't just talk about something without looking at the foundations and the fundamentals. And a lot of times, if we get the fundamentals wrong, then we're going to misinterpret, other things downstream. And then we come up with a pretty garbled picture. And that's one of the things I really want to avoid, which is why I would go, episode after episode and try to lay a foundation for bigger topics that we would discuss. So for example, with the atherosclerosis series, I had built up to this by talking individually in separate episodes about different components of the immune system, about lipoproteins, right? And just kind of making sure that we had a grounding for that language and the science before we dove into something bigger and way more complex like atherosclerosis. So, I know that doesn't sit well with a lot of people. Sometimes we want a quick answer, but when we do that, a lot of times we miss things that might be fundamental and vital to our understanding. And as a result, as I said, we get a garbled picture, and that's not very useful for anyone, right? So I'd like to continue in the vein of just kind of systematically looking at the science so that we can have a nuanced approach to these big topics. But I understand they can be very technical, and maybe I'll just decrease the frequency of the episodes to kind of deal with that, right? And like I said, have a different format for a more generalized audience. So please let me know what you think. Put it in the comments or write to me on my website, vivianlohmd.com, VYVYANELOHMD.com. All right, so this being episode 52, I'd like to commemorate this 1-year mark by dedicating this episode to a mentor and someone who's been a brilliant teacher, someone who's been a great role model for me as a physician. And this is Dr. Mark Drapkin. I have been very fortunate to have Mark as my attending, my chief. And, I don't think there's anyone who's been in touch with Mark who hasn't learned loads from him, right? Every interaction with Mark is a learning opportunity in science, in medicine, and just in being a wonderful human being, because that's what he is. And his specialty was infectious diseases. He doesn't practice anymore, but he knew way beyond just his specialty. He knew everything in our eyes, those of us who had studied under him. He was able to take the most complex cases and just synthesize them. He'd see a patient, lay his hands on them. It was like watching dowsing or something, put his magical hands on them. And then he'd come up with this amazing differential, and he was almost always spot on. I mean, he always had the top 3 diagnoses, right? He always hit it. And it was just magic watching him practice. And I am quite careful with the use of the word brilliant as an adjective to describe anyone. But, I use it unreservedly when I talk about Mark Drapkin. So I'd like to dedicate this episode to him. This episode is also going to be talking about an infectious disease, tuberculosis. So I thought it would be appropriate as well. Let's go. All right. We keep hearing over and over again that atherosclerosis is an inflammatory disease, right? And actually, as I've already mentioned, the research now is looking at the inflammatory aspects of atherosclerosis to see how we can intervene to get better results for our patients, right? So while we're still, at least in the medical field, pushing the statins, I think the research for sure has gone way beyond that. And we're really looking at how to modulate and manipulate the immune response, because we know of atherosclerosis as an inflammatory disease, but still very hard to conceive of. When we say inflammatory disease, what does that mean? Again, we get very superficial, very generalized. We throw the word around, and there's no deep understanding of what's actually happening. So I thought that it might be useful to look at an infectious disease, because we know that infections actually stimulate an immune response in our body, right? And that the process of inflammation is often in response to a pathogen invading the body. So inflammation has really two big columns that we can put it in. One would be in response to a pathogen, as I just alluded to, but the other column would be what we call sterile inflammation, right? So when we have the PAMPs and DAMPs that I've been going on about, right, the pathogen-associated molecular patterns, we're referring to infectious agents that your body is dealing with. But when we refer to the DAMPs, the danger or damage associated molecular patterns, we're referring essentially to sterile inflammation. There doesn't seem to be an infectious agent involved, okay? But the processes are quite similar in both cases. So I'm going to take us through tuberculosis, which is an infectious disease. And then I'm going to look at atherosclerosis through the lens of tuberculosis. Nice that they rhyme, right? Because I want you to see the parallels, and I want you to realize that what's going on in atherosclerosis is actually a normal response that your body has that is sort of modified for this process of atherosclerosis. All right. So tuberculosis, most of you know, is quite rampant throughout the world. And just in the US alone, there's probably about 13 million people infected with TB. And generally, when you get this infection, right, there's a small percentage of people who can basically fight off the bacteria and, be done with it. That's maybe about 10% of people who get infected. And the vast majority of people will get this disease and they have what we call latent infection. In other words, they harbor this disease, but it's not active in their bodies. And so they're not actually suffering from it directly. And then, of course, we have a proportion of people who actually succumb to the disease. It takes a very virulent course, and they do very poorly and may die, right? So we have this range of responses to Mycobacterium tuberculosis, which is the causative agent of tuberculosis. All right, the first point I want to make about TB is that in conjunction with other virulent factors, these mycobacteria also have lipoproteins. Now, I've talked about this in an earlier episode about bacterial lipoproteins, but here I just want to note again that MTB, which again is Mycobacterium tuberculosis, there are many lipoproteins that are associated with it, right? And in fact, if you disrupt the synthesis of these lipoproteins in MTB, then actually you attenuate the infection in vivo, right? So if you interrupt the formation of lipoproteins in these organisms, they're not going to be as good at infecting cells in our bodies. And in fact, we've looked at mycobacterium that are deficient in certain lipoproteins, and we've been thinking about using them as candidates for live vaccines because, here we can stimulate an immune response, but they're not really going to be effective in infecting the cells in our bodies, right? So that makes it a possible candidate for a live vaccine. Now, I'll just mention briefly one lipoprotein, which is LPRL. And this is exclusively found in MTB complex. Now, the thing about LPRL is that it actually binds to lysosomes. And this is going to have a major effect in the activity of the lysosomes. All right, if you remember, the lysosomes, I talked about this in a previous episode. See why these episodes build on each other. But lysosomes are really these spaces in your cells that I had, kind of called little recycling centers, right? And basically, there we go down and we break down substances and we can recycle them for use in the cell. Now, when we have LPRL from MTB, it's going to interfere with the lytic activity of enzymes in the lysosome. So what happens is now, since the lipoprotein has bound to those lysosomes and it's not working well, not allowing the lysosome to work well, then the lysosome is going to be engorged with lipoproteins, right? And when this happens, we get more and more dysfunction in the cell, and we get the formation of, yes, a foam cell. Does that sound familiar, right? So foam cells. Let's look at foam cells in atherosclerosis. I've mentioned that oxidized LDLs, they get picked up by different receptors, scavenger receptors in macrophages, right? And these would be things like LOX1 and also things like scavenger receptor class A, CD36, very important one, and also the toll-like receptors, right? Now, the difference between these scavenger receptors and the LDL receptor is that generally there is no feedback loop. In other words, you are not going to downregulate the presence of these receptors with an intracellular load of cholesterol. Normally, when your cholesterol piles up, you downregulate the receptors, right, for LDLR. But with these other receptor types, we don't have that negative feedback loop. And so as a result, guess what? We are just going to accumulate more and more of the oxidized LDL. And we have engorgement of the lysosome. And it turns out that only 50% of oxidized LDL is degraded in the lysosomes. Now, the macrophages that are phagocytosing and taking in the oxidized LDLs, they have a way, the oxidized LDLs are going to act in such a way that they cause the lysosomes in those macrophages to become more alkaline. And normally, the lysosome has to have a certain pH. It has to be acidic for the enzymes to work well. So we have these lysosomal hydrolases that need a low pH, an acidic pH, to function well. But with the oxidized LDLs, right, they can cause the lysosome to actually be more alkaline, right? Normally we have the vacuolar ATPase, which I talked about in a previous episode, right? Pump hydrogen ions in and then, kind of keep the lysosome acidic. But now we have changed the pH through these oxidized LDLs, and for that reason, those enzymes are not functioning. And then most of the LDLs can start to accumulate, the oxidized LDLs start to accumulate, and we get this engorgement again in the lysosomes, and now we have foam cells, right? So we see this similarity between MTB and also in atherosclerosis. I just want to point out too that we see this with other pathogens as well. So there's a pathogen with the euphonous name of, let me try this, Porphyromonas gingivalis, right? And also more commonly Chlamydia pneumoniae. Now these pathogens actually induce LDL uptake by macrophages, and they impair, again, the lysosomal activity, and we have foam cell formation with those pathogens. Now, in particular, I just want to add that chlamydia pneumoniae is an interesting one because we see that in plaques, in active plaques that are prone to rupture, that can cause, disease and so forth. Those plaques seem to have a propensity to accumulate chlamydia pneumoniae. So perhaps, right, this was not so much sterile inflammation in that sense, that it actually was an infectious agent driving that immune response. Okay, all right, moving along. When we look at MTB, what's really important in how it infects and spreads in the body is lipid metabolism, how it manipulates the lipids, all right? So these foamy macrophages that you see in TB, they are actually rich sites of prostaglandin E2 generation. And so we have a lot of these eicosanoid pathways that are important for mycobacterial growth. And that bacteria, MTB, knows how to manipulate these pathways for its own purposes. And in fact, when infected with TB, right, the host genes, the host cell genes for lipid metabolism are upregulated. And we have, again, a lot of lipid metabolism going on, which will lead to the formation of the granulomas, which contain a lot of these LDL-derived host lipids. They contain free cholesterol, cholesterol ester, they have lactocylls, ceramides, and in the case of MTB, they have a lot of triacylglycerols, okay? Especially triacylglycerols. More prominent in the granulomas of MTB. In atheromas, we tend to see more of the, modified LDLs there. But, and therefore the free cholesterol crystals and cholesterol esters. We see a lot more of the triacylglycerols in MTB. So that's one difference there. And we also find that MTB enhanced PPAR expression, so that's a transcription factor that's very much involved in lipid metabolism, and increased lipid droplets in macrophages, right? And this impacts the survival of MTB, right? So it's going to kind of, again, start to have this accumulation of lipid droplets, which contributes to the formation of foam cells. And we know we see this change in lipid metabolism when we look at the atherosclerotic plaque. I did a whole episode on cholesterol metabolism in atherosclerosis and how it impacts the disease process, pointing out that it was, while not the prime initiator, it certainly had a very important role in immunometabolism and therefore impacting the immune response there. One other thing I just want to point out, and this is kind of well known, but worth pointing out here, with TB, there's a huge association between the vitamin D receptor and lipid metabolism in the infected macrophages. And if you treated those macrophages with vitamin D, you actually stopped the accumulation of those lipid droplets, all right? So manipulating lipid metabolism can impact the survival of the organism. All right, now let's just move on and talk briefly about cytokines that impact the granuloma in MTB and also in the atheroma. Okay, so we have MTB antigens that are going to stimulate formation of cytokines such as TNF alpha, interleukin 1 alpha and interleukin 1 beta, interleukin 6. These are all secreted by the macrophages, right? And they actually increase the phagocytosis and uptake of oxidized LDLs by those macrophages, right? So we have this secretion of cytokines that are going to be pro-inflammatory and stimulate more phagocytosis and more uptake of oxidized LDLs. Now, one thing that has started to be of interest to researchers, both in TB and also in atherosclerosis, would be the role of interferons. And I've not talked a whole load about interferons, but I did mention them in the cholesterol metabolism episode, so you could go listen there. We have, type 2 interferon, basically interferon gamma, which is very pro-inflammatory, and that's associated with atherosclerosis, right? And we do see action of interferon gamma as your immune response to MTB as well. But what's actually been more interesting, more subtle, has been type 1 interferons, okay? And this is the different type 1 interferons here. And they're interesting because they're very important for antiviral responses in your body, but they are also very important for modulating the immune response in general. So, while we think of them as strong antivirals, type 1 interferons also are interesting because they have a range of responses that sometimes can be quite surprising. So we see that let's just talk about MTB at this point, right? It turns out that type 1 interferons in MTB give a survival advantage to the bacteria. And the way it does this is it actually makes the foam cell formation, right, actually more avid. So we have a greater foam cell formation, and we have less macrophages that can actually fight off the infection, because those foam cells are basically not able to be effective in fighting off the organisms. And while those foam cells in TB are forming, I'll have you note, and some of them are dying off, right? These macrophages are dying. But even as they're dying, the MTB is proliferating and doing very well intracellularly, right? So it's a way for the bacteria to keep growing, to keep proliferating. And at the same time, what it does is with type 1 interferons, it uses type 1 interferons to kind of almost have a level of immunosuppression in those macrophages, right? And that's why when you look at a granuloma, when you look at the lesion that is associated with TB, primarily we think of pulmonary TB in the lungs, right? You're going to look at what we call the caseating granuloma. And this is because it has a center that looks cheesy, right? Thick and cheesy. Actually, it's just pus, right? And what it is a necrotic center where cells are dying, and there's just a whole mess in the center there. And that necrotic center is actually full of dead macrophages, macrophages that are ineffective, macrophages that are more immunosuppressed, right? Now, interestingly, we see that type 1 interferons are associated with cardiovascular disease. And when we look at experiments that use type 1 interferons, we see increased foam cells, right? Increased netosis. We talked about nets in previous episodes, extracellular traps by neutrophils, right? We talked about those. We have increase in endothelial dysfunction. And also, we see changes in phenotypes of dendritic cells and also lymphocytes, the B and T cells, yeah? In addition, type 1 interferons are able to actually keep the smooth muscle progenitor cells immature, and they kind of seem to impact the smooth muscle progenitor cells. And by the way, I want to point out that a lot of the cells that are engulfing the oxidized LDLs are not just macrophages. They are also vascular smooth muscle cells that have sort of transformed into macrophages. So, right, there is this change in the phenotypes of these smooth muscle cells. And here we see type 1 interferons are impacting, how these smooth muscle progenitor cells develop there. Okay, and the result of these consequences would be, of course, worsened atherosclerotic outcomes. So again, we have more of the foam cell, and if you've remembered from previous episodes, I kept emphasizing that actually within the necrotic core of the atheroma, we tended to have more of the M2 macrophages, the more anti-inflammatory tissue repair, and they're secreting a lot of matrix metalloproteinases enzymes to help remodel, right, and the tissue that they're in. So as a result, with the center of the atheroma being more anti-inflammatory and more in this tissue repair mode, we see actually the degradation of the extracellular matrix there, and we have an amorphous central messy core that is the necrotic core. And those lesions can be really bad when they rupture. And it turns out it's the macrophages that are non-foamy near the atheroma that are way more pro-inflammatory. And similar to the case of MTB, there are macrophages that are secreting the type 1 interferons and manipulating the type 1 interferons are able now to change how the macrophages that have been infected by TB are acting, and so they become less effective and allow the propagation of the bacteria. And here, with cardiovascular disease, it might be that the same thing is happening, that we have, a subset of macrophages that are secreting type 1 interferons and then causing a more anti-inflammatory profile in the macrophages within the necrotic core, and worsening the breakdown of tissue there. So very interesting there when we look at interferon response. Quite similar in many cases, and I'm sure there are also important differences that we need to look at some point, right? But I just am pointing these things out because I hope you realize that when we look at the atheroma, really you're looking at something that your body has learned to develop in the case of chronic inflammation. And generally, when we form a granuloma, as I've said in previous episodes, the granuloma is there because you have chronic inflammation, and your body is trying to wall off the offending agent, right? So that we don't expose the body in a continued fashion to that offending agent, right? In the case of MTB, it happens to be Mycobacterium tuberculosis, right? And your body wants to wall it off because it says, well, MTB is really hard to kill. It is. It is hard to kill. And macrophages don't kill it very well, right? So, okay, if we can't kill it, then we're just going to wall it off, right? Now, same thing with the atheroma. We have, continued exposure to neoantigens that might be prompting an immune response. And in order to protect the body, we start to try to wall it off, right? We have a reaction that forms an atheroma, right? But it's a way, I think, of the body trying to kind of, limit where the disease process is. All right. Now, if you look at the different granulomas in MTB, I suppose technically it's granulomata, but okay, we'll just say granulomas, right? We have the well-walled granulomas, and these are well-defined, and you can see them on chest x-ray sometimes, the GON complex, GHON, right? And if they're calcified, further stabilized by calcification, then it's a rank complex, RANKE, and you see that a calcified granuloma on X-ray, right? Now, with the atherosclerotic process, we can see that we can have a well-defined atheroma that is well contained, and we may have, you know, some calcification to stabilize that plaque over time. But with MTB, we also have cases where now the center of the granuloma is undergoing a lot of degradation. There's a lot of necrosis. Cells are dying, right? And we have this liquid gooey mess that is what we call the caseating granuloma or soft tubercle, right? And this is in danger of rupturing. And when that happens, we're going to spread tons of MTB bacteria all over the lungs. Okay, so when it bursts open, yeah, all the MTB is going to spill out as well. And what happens when an atheroma bursts open? Yeah, all the contents burst open, and yeah, the consequences are not great, right? Because it's very inflammatory, and we're going to stimulate a thrombotic event in the bloodstream. Okay, so you can see again the parallels where when we are successful in walling off the infection, then it's stable disease, it's latent, and probably for most people will never bother them the rest of their lives, right? But if it's unstable and we have a caseating granuloma, that means the center is necrotic and eventually at some point it's going to rupture or burst. Then we spread the bacteria and all hell can break loose, right? Now with the atheroma, same thing, we can have a stabilized plaque and that's contained and, you know, well and good. But if we have a rich necrotic core and it's unstable over time, if that ruptures, that can cause a major coronary event. Okay, so my whole point, and by the way, you know, when you talk about TB, yeah, it's a classic, the formation of these chronic granulomas and so forth. It's a classic type 4 hypersensitivity reaction, right? And those are very much associated with autoimmunity, okay? So you can see, hopefully, the parallels between the granulomas that are formed in TB and also the atheroma. Now, again, they're not exactly the same, but it's just your body's way of trying to contain chronic inflammation. All right? So there are many other fascinating things about the parallels between MTB and atherosclerosis that I didn't even touch on because, again, trying not to jam this episode with too much technical jargon. But it's been a pet topic of mine because it involves infectious diseases, something I'm very interested in. It involves macrophages, again, very interested in that, and inflammation, the immune response, right? Something I think about every day, and then relating that to atherosclerosis. So there's a lot that we can learn from MTB infection and your body's response to MTB, and then relating that to how we could look at atherosclerosis. The main points I think I want to emphasize here, the importance of those lipoproteins, okay, that activate the toll-like receptor 2s, probably in conjunction with TLR6 as well, right, with MTB, right? We get activation and then we start this inflammatory process here. And if it were not for those lipoproteins, we can actually attenuate infection in the host, right? And maybe even completely get rid of it, right? So it's really key here that those lipoproteins have a very key role in the pathogenesis of MTB. And I think there's a similar thing going on with atherosclerosis, that with oxidized and modified LDLs, right, this causes a distinct immune response in your body, right? And then secondly, the importance of lipid metabolism in how MTB manipulates your immune system for its own good. And we get changes in lipid metabolism in the atheroma, right, in the atherosclerotic plaque. And I think that those changes in lipid metabolism in the immune cells, right, will prompt again the immune response in the atheroma. Yeah, I'm thinking of, you know, certain aspects of immunometabolism that we won't get into at this point, but they really are fascinating how basically we actually are going to change the metabolism and decrease energy metabolism in macrophages with MTB. And I think that a similar thing probably happens with atherosclerosis. And then thirdly, the impact of cytokines and how MTB uses those cytokines to confer an advantage, a survival advantage for itself, right? And we see similar cytokine signaling in atherosclerosis. And this might be why we have, the worsening of necrosis in the necrotic core. This might be why we have accelerated foam cell formation and endothelial dysfunction when we look at those parallel pathways that are used, the cytokine signaling in atherosclerosis. Okay, those were my main points, and I hope you'll look at TB and you'll look at atherosclerosis with different eyes after this episode. All right, so please check out my live stream events. I really enjoy interacting with all of you live, getting your questions, getting your comments, and just having a really fun discussion with you. I get so many good questions and they always kind of jazz me up, right? So please do come check out my events on vivianlowmd.com under the events page to see when the next live stream will be. And then again, I love teaching. I love teaching my patients, and I love teaching other professionals, medical students, and so forth. So on tuberculosis.com, if you are someone who wants to improve your metabolic health and you want to learn the science and really the applications that you should use to have the best metabolic health, you can go to tuberculosis.com. And for those of you who are healthcare providers or health coaches and you want a deeper insight into all the processes, the pathways, right, for what's going on in your body, you want to go beyond the superficial, you're not satisfied with the, inflammation or the generalized explanations, then you could also go to tuberculosis.com, and there I have courses for healthcare providers and health coaches as well. And then finally, I just want to say thank you everyone for listening in for this whole year. There have been some of you who have just been so regular in listening, and I always look forward to your comments. And do let me know what you think, because at this point, I think I am going to go towards once a month frequency for VLMD rounds, and then kind of pair that with another once a month different format for a more generalized lay audience, just to make my work a lot easier. All right. So that's all I have for today. Again, thank you so much. And I'll see you on the next episode of VLMD Rounds. I'm signing out now as Dr. Vivian Low, and I sing the body electric. Bye.